Hey everyone, and welcome to my patch 13.10 tier list. This is going to be my tier list just for all elos. I will make a separate tier list for lower elos, so this is assuming that you can play the champ and you're picking it in the right situation and stuff like that. There's a few things that have changed the mid meta a little bit this patch, so those are the roaming changes for a start. There's also Ghostblade, the crit items, and lastly the chapter change. So we will go through them all and kind of talk about the champs affected by it. Bear in mind, again, like take this with a grain of salt. We're not that far into the patch, so of course some things could be wrong. Starting out with our S tier though, we have Ahri, Fizz, Pantheon, and LeBlanc. So Ahri is always a champ that's really good in solo queue. She has a lot of mobility, she's very blindable, got great gank setup. She's basically like the perfect solo queue champ. Even when Ahri is not super strong, I think she's honestly pretty good in solo queue. She's just kind of really perfect for thriving in the chaos of solo queue. And I think that the chapter change was actually pretty nice for Ahri. Normally, if you're in a difficult matchup at Ahri, it is kind of difficult to grab your chapter on first base, but now it's a lot easier. So I really like the chapter change for Ahri. Feels really good. Next up on our S tier is Fizz. So Fizz is one of the few assassins that benefits from the chapter change because, you know, he rushes it, whereas most assassins do not. So that feels really good. And I think he's also not as impacted by the roaming changes as some of the other champs because he can lane fairly effectively. Obviously matchup dependent. If you are using him as a counter pick, I think he's still very strong. I even tried Futures Market on Fizz just to rush out the chapter even quicker. I didn't like start Sapphire or anything, but just having Futures Market honestly felt kind of good. Now it is a little matchup dependent because a lot of matchups as Fizz you want to rush boots, so it's not something I think you can do all the time, but it gives you some options, and when you reach that point you have really good wave clear in Fizz, so I think it's pretty good overall. Next is Pantheon. I think Pantheon is just an OP solo queue champ in general. He also benefits a lot from the Ghostblade change. Like Ghostblade is really, really good on pretty much every AD champ, including Pantheon. And I think champions that have globals but aren't like super reliant on roaming are still very strong. So an example would be, you know, if we compare a champ like Pantheon compared to a champ like Ryze. Like Ryze he's got good gank setup and he's got like fairly good roaming, but he doesn't really like want to skirmish or anything. And skirmishing is very important at the moment. Whereas it feels like with Pantheon you kind of get the best of that. You've got good gank setup, you've got great skirmishing, and you have the ability to roam with the global. So I think, you know, it seems kind of weird, I think, to compare these champs, but to me, it's like they're both point and click gank setup. They both have like an ultimate that roams, but Pantheon's just a lot stronger in the 1v1 and the 2v2, which feels very nice. Maybe slight weakness to Pantheon is that there aren't that many meta AP junglers, mainly because, again, AD junglers have been stronger because of the Ghostblade change, but I think he's like criminally underrated, honestly, and probably should be played a bit more, and he's also very simple to play, which is nice. LeBlanc is the last one I have in the S tier, and this one could maybe go a little lower depending on how good you are at the champ. I think all these three, it's like, these are champs that they have high skill caps, but they're not insanely difficult, whereas I think LeBlanc is a champ with both a high skill floor and a high skill ceiling. But I think she deserves the S tier, and I think the main reason that LeBlanc isn't played more is because there are effective counters to her in the meta, and also it feels like Ahri a lot of the time is the better blind. But I think LeBlanc overall has like more carry potential, and she works very, very well with the AD junglers that are getting played at the moment. So I think it's strong. But again, like you might find it a lot easier to play something like Ahri or Fizz. So I've moved the AD assassins up quite a bit. So I've got Zed, Talon, and Qiyana all in the A tier here. I think there's an argument maybe for Zed going into the S tier. The only reason I didn't is because I think AD assassins in general are more of counter picks, whereas I think like all these champs can be blinded. And I think again, like AP junglers aren't as strong, so it's like less necessary, I guess, to have an AD mid. But I think in isolation, these champs are very, very strong. So obviously Ghostblade is very overstated. It's giving a ton of lethality. I think it's 38 when it's fully stacked. So it's a very, very good item to rush. And I think while the roaming changes kind of nerf these champs a little bit, I think the combination of Ghostblade as well as the BT shield bow changes to ADC means that ADCs are a lot more killable. So I think overall you'll kind of find your job to be a lot easier as these champs in solo queue at the moment. I guess there are, you know, there's a lot of competing factors, like chapter being a bit cheaper sometimes makes these lanes harder depending on your matchup and stuff like that. But I think overall, they are very strong in the patch. Maybe they start to fall off as you get very high elo. Like I think if we're looking at Challenger, maybe they're a little bit lower. But I think honestly, if you're Master and below, you're going to have a lot of success playing these champs. I put Yone and Yasuo both in B tier, and I'm not super 100% confident in that because, you know, the build is still sort of being figured out. I've seen a lot of people trying out Shiv. I've seen a lot of people just going for Bork and stuff like that. So it's kind of hard to know exactly how strong they are. But I kind of feel like, you know, with AP junglers not being strongest, again, because AD junglers with Ghostblade are much stronger, I think that kind of makes them, you know, again, if you want an AD mid, there's probably better options. And also I think the chapter change actually pretty heavily impacts these champs because the nice thing about versing chapter champs with these is you could rush your Berserker Greaves for 1100 and kind of, base it a bit more favorable spot. If you ended up having, say, Berserker Greaves against someone who didn't have chapter, you're in a very good spot. But now it's quite hard to do that, especially because you're kind of expecting to not be able to get all the CS early. Again, it is matchup dependent, right? And naturally, if you counter pick with these champs, you're going to have a better time. But I think it's just made them a little more difficult. But, I mean, we'll kind of see. This could be something that my opinion changes on as the patch goes on. ADC's mid is another one that has changed a fair amount on the patch. So something like Akshan, for example, has a couple different builds. Stormrazor is very strong, so you're most likely going to go Stormrazor into Rage Wave. There's Stormrazor into Yomu's that has been experimented with. There's other champs I'd kind of be interested to see how they work out, like Lethality Varus. With Yomu's, is there potential for maybe like a Lethality Lucian build to come back? Something like Tristana obviously does make use of Stormrazor, but isn't kind of a beneficiary of kind of the on-hit changes. So for now, I've got these as kind of my positions for the ADC's mid. I think Akshan does feel quite strong, but it's another one that I think when the kind of optimal builds get worked out, could change a little bit. I want to quickly kind of talk about the game itself with the roaming changes and the chapter change. So how do I think the roaming changes really affected the game? I think that you do have to be a little more careful now when you roam, and I definitely don't think you can spam roam as much as you did before. So a champion like Katarina that would just spam roam is definitely like a lot more punished by this. You're going to lose more plates and stuff as a result. It's just like riskier overall, and I think even like a champ like Ryze that would kind of roam after every wave is pretty impacted, because I think now you kind of need to build up multiple waves before you roam, or you need your side lane to build a roam. So I think you definitely can still roam, it's just you can't roam as frequently as before and as carefree as before, I suppose. So champs that kind of roam on windows, like a champ like Galio, for example, he'll have like his ult and he'll roam on that, or Pantheon or something. Even like something like Kiana or Talon that will roam, not constantly, but when they're kind of strong with Ignite, with Flash, with ult, they're pretty strong. But champs that would kind of just roam because they can roam whenever, again, like Katarina, Ryze, I think are not particularly good on the patch. And the chapter change, I think, is kind of a weird one. I think the main difference it makes is it makes mages a bit more competitive in those skirmishes early, because something you would end up kind of happening before is that, you would base on your first base, you maybe grab like, Amptome Darksteel boots or something, and then while you'd be in a pretty strong spot for your lane, the problem is, like, if you were using mana in lane, you might not actually be able to fight anything in skirmishes, and you're, in a lot of danger of just kind of being like losing the war of attrition, I guess, to someone that had Dawn Shield or just energy or something like that. I think now that's not so much the case, that you can definitely grab chapter very early, and that kind of allows you to be a bit more present in those skirmishes. But the thing is, most mages tend to not be that great at skirmishes anyway, so it's like you're still kind of on the losing end of that, but you can kind of contest them a little more easily, which feels sort of nice. And I think some of the other things, like starting Sapphire Crystal with refillable, trying to rush out the chapter really early with Futures Market, as well as people have been trying, I saw Sapphire on 1 health pot, so you can get it really early. I'm not too sure how I feel about this, to be honest, because I think the thing is, it almost felt better before, because you could get chapter on your first base and your opponent couldn't. And I think that was really important, is the fact that, with Futures and Sapphire Start before, it's like you would always be able to grab chapter and they couldn't, because you could base early, and achieving 1300 gold on first base was very, very difficult. I think now the problem is that even though with the kind of rush of getting chapters super early, the problem is your opponent can still get it on the first base, at least like if you're in a mage versus mage matchup. And I think if you get it in a matchup where you're versus an assassin, you're definitely like better in the 1v1, but you're consciously giving up something like the catalyst, or some kind of defensive item or anything like that. So I think while the Sapphire Start refillable has potential in some matchups, I don't think it's to the point where you'd be using it all the time, and I don't think it has maybe like as big an effect as people might have thought. But it's something that I'm still experimenting with, and I think everyone is kind of still experimenting with. So I might make a full video kind of on my thoughts on that, and like some of the matchups I think it's effective in, some of the champs I think it's good for. But I think at least for now, it's kind of a net zero change, other than mages being a little bit strong in those early skirmishes, which I think is kind of nice. So guys, that's going to be it for this video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I think it's always kind of difficult to do a tier list after a big patch like this, because so many things get changed in ways that you maybe don't expect, and that affects other things as well. And another thing I kind of struggle with is knowing when I should release the patch. I've brought this up before, but the earlier you release it, kind of the more useful it is, I think, for people that are on the patch, right? Because they want to know very early on, what is actually good. And I think the problem with that is the earlier you release it, the less accurate it is. But if you release it too late, it's not useful to anyone. So I've kind of found a middle ground here, and hopefully it's good. I will also try and get the low elo tier list out in fairly short order. Not sure if it'll be tomorrow or the day after, but we will see. So once again, thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.